The conflict in Ukraine took an unexpected turn when the Ukrainian army launched a daring attack across the Russian border, stunning Moscow. How could this happen? What left the Russian army unable to defend its territory? Whether Ukraine was pushed back or not, this event forever changed the course of the conflict. To understand Russia's defeat, we need to explore the factor that weakened Moscow more than any Ukrainian attack. NATO Restraint: How the West Hurt Ukraine versus Russia. NATO Restraint. The West and Putin have played cat and mouse throughout this crisis. West has slowly upped its engagement, giving Ukraine more powerful weapons. Putin always threatened nuclear destruction. Every time, the West hesitated. Britain sent a few Challenger tanks to Ukraine after a year of debate over sending modern tanks. Despite these advances, top-tier equipment had limitations. Western powers tightened restrictions to avert Putin's wrath. Ukraine was initially barred from attacking Crimea and cross-border attacks, and Russian opposition troops couldn't receive weapons. Russia exploited its ability to unleash attacks from behind its border, sheltered from Ukrainian reprisal, which hurt Ukraine. Imagine a boxing match to understand this ridiculousness. Russia has a longer reach than Ukraine. Ukraine cannot get close enough to punch. Russia can jab at will. But this fight might end easily. This summer, the stakes soared. Russia gathered troops and weaponry across the border from Kharkiv for a big onslaught. Ukrainian intelligence had warned of an attack, but the location was unknown until the shelling. Ukraine was desperate, with 50,000 men ready to strike. In an unexpected move, President Biden authorized Ukraine to employ American long-range weapons to stop Russia. Ukraine might strike the Russian military on its turf for the first time in the war. HIMARS, GMLRS, and ATACMS rockets hit Russian troop concentrations, vehicles, and equipment, halting the Kharkiv advance. Ukraine launched nearly 120 accurate rockets, destroying Russian positions across the border. President Biden authorized limited use of American weapons in Russia in response to Russian aggression, or at a specific distance from the border. This still kept most Russian high-value objectives, such as airfield, out of reach, but also ensured that Russia could never deploy forces on its side of the border without being harassed again. But none could have predicted how the paradigm would change again 2 months later. Even after losing the Kharkiv operation and sustaining heavy casualties in cross-border missile and rocket attacks, Russia believed the old paradigm was still in play. NATO would never sanction Ukrainian military action in Russia unless it with long-range weaponry. After 2 years of brandishing the nuclear saber, Putin wanted the West to self-deter. This leads to the Kursk-Ukraine border situation before the UAF attack. This war was waged in extraordinary luxury by Russia. Putin has removed troops and equipment from all NATO borders, despite his propaganda that NATO threatens Russia's existence. Even the Kaliningrad exclave has suffered substantial Ukrainian service drawdowns. Putin knows, despite the hyperbole, that NATO never wanted a military conflict with Russia. This allows him to leave only a token army on his NATO borders. This also applies to Ukraine. The UAF could now attack Russian targets in Ukraine, but Putin knew Ukraine would never invade Russia, especially with NATO armaments. Russian border security. Small cross-border attacks by separatist organizations were a concern, but they were easily rebuffed within a few days and caused little political or military damage to the Kremlin. Russian soldiers have only defended its border with Ukraine with enough force to dissuade small-scale attacks and respond to a clash, not enough to stop a conventional army trying to grab and hold Russian territory. Russian border forces are mostly FSB border security troops and conscripts, which are far smaller than in a regular battle between adjacent nations. In a normal conflict, Russia would deploy substantial garrisons along its border with Ukraine and picket forces to notice an invasion attempt that the nearest garrison force would instantly respond to. Despite lacking the manpower to defend the border, even this economic approach would require tens of thousands of soldiers due to the 160 kilometers of Ukraine-controlled border. Even with this considerably decreased military level, Russia doesn't have to secure its border because Ukraine's Western partners limit its hands. Instead, it may send tens of thousands of soldiers and their equipment into Ukraine's front lines, leaving its border secured by less well-equipped and trained paramilitary groups and conscripts. This has put a strain on Ukrainian defenders, who must maintain their border security forces out of fear Russia may quickly mobilize an invasion army on its side of the border. These border forces, unlike their Russian counterparts, need armored vehicles and air defense systems to prevent a flanking attack that may collapse the front. Invasion of Ukraine successful. Easy to see the outcome. Ukraine used complacency to great effect early in August. Russia's border protection failed again when border troops ignored reports. In late July, FSB border troops and conscript augmentees reported extraordinary Ukrainian activity, fearing a big raid. Russia probably dismissed these reports out of complacency, but we won't know the truth until after the war, and the archives are opened. Perhaps Ukraine was massing soldiers near the border to force them to relocate from the east, where Russia is making inroads. As Russia is now notorious to international observers for its incompetence, these reports may never have reached the line of command. They weren't shared with the Russian defense apparatus if they did. Russia's FSB, National Guard, and regular military lack a single chain of command, so it's unclear where a failure happened, but opportunities are many. Russia was so complacent that it monitored its wartime border. The Ukrainian invasion went smoothly and secretly until the last minute, demonstrating Ukraine's operational security. Russia has no reason to not conduct rigorous border surveillance at all times. Russian patrols using observation drones should have seen the buildup and alerted authorities. The third failure is Russia's unprepared physical defenses. Ukraine faced criticism in Kharkiv when local leaders failed to fortify against a Russian invasion. However, Russia's border fortifications differ significantly from Ukrainian defenses north of Kharkiv. The best reports say the Russians had 2 lines of trenches, but they were poorly manned. Ukrainian invaders drove past defensive fortifications where they faced heavy resistance. Cut off from the rear, defenders fled, surrendered, or made a disastrous last fight. The border performance of Chechen fighters illustrates this. Kadiva writes, members of the Chechen 141st Special Motorized Regiment were devoted to Ramzan Kadyrov. Akhmat Special Forces, another name, is dreaded even by Russian troops as the best, most aggressive warriors in the Russian armed forces. These TikTok warriors broke and ran more often in real warfare until February 24, 2022. They duplicated this in Kursk Oblast, where Ukraine arrested hundreds of Chechens and showed their documents as the Akhmat commander escaped to the rear. He stated in a TikTok video that Akhmat failed to guard the border when Ukrainians drove past them. However, captured Chechen travel documentation contradicts this. Besides physical shortcomings, planning, strategy, and command and control failures cause defensive coordination difficulties. First, Russia lacked a realistic incursion defense. Russia should have set up border pickets instead of defending a vast border with minimal troops. Rapid response forces with drones, armored vehicles, and manned portable air defenses should have been stationed every dozen kilometers and several kilometers behind the border. Picket forces would have reported the attack and broken contact, trading low-value territory. Rapid response forces from surrounding encampments would then be pooled and dispatched to counterattack. If confronting a stronger enemy, the United Response Force might wait or counterattack to push invaders back across the border. Meanwhile, response forces from distant encampments might organize and dispatch augmentation forces to the front within 24-48 hours. Since Russia's limited manpower could have properly manned the border and various defensive lines, this approach would have worked successfully. Russia couldn't reach it for many reasons. First, Russia's border and regional forces have separate command chains. Russian troops. Even in Ukraine, the Russian army struggles to coordinate joint operations amongst branches, sometimes even larger forces. In its badly guarded border, Russia cannot conduct combined arms operations. Local commanders disagreed on how to respond to the Ukrainian invasion with conscripts and other forces, even a week later. Russia's offensive to limit the UAF is regarded with considerable mistrust. The Kursk forces composition is the biggest issue. The Russian National Guard, FSB Border Guard Service, Interior Ministry personnel, regular army conscripts, PMCs, and other irregular forces are responding. All have autonomous command structures, no joint one. Russia must make it up as it goes. Due to a lack of planning and their problems with regular army personnel in Ukraine, a Russian response to Ukraine's invasion is unlikely to be well organized or effective. Being highly effective does not mean being fruitless. Russia can still send many men to the meat grinder. The Russian retaliation is unlikely to be effective compared to Ukrainian forces, who are said to be combat veterans and seasoned commanders. This time, Russia may not be able to simply grind to victory for one reason. Russian battalions were overcome by the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk's violence and speed, or annihilated in the combat. The UAF mostly fought conscripts, who could not serve as expeditionary forces outside Russia by law. Although some conscripts have ended up in Ukraine, Putin is sensitive about the mass employment of conscripts in conflict. Following the invasion, he spoke with the mothers of conscripted soldiers unintentionally deployed to Ukraine and worked to prevent it from happening again. These conscripts are notoriously unprepared. Even in peacetime, they face significant physical and sexual abuse, low morale, and poor equipment and training. In wartime, Russia's border conscripts have acted as predicted, with the UAF capturing hundreds of prisoners and inflicting an unsubstantiated but large number of deaths. Mass deaths of Russian troops in attrition wars are common. New this time is that photographs and videos of fallen conscripts are circulating on social media, but they're dying on Russian front lawns. HIMARS ambushed a Russian reinforcement convoy. Famously, visual estimates of casualties are approximately 3 dozen, as the convoy was destroyed in front of Russian homes. Finally, Ukraine's ambitious moves have revealed Russia's military strategy's weaknesses, changing the conflict. Old narratives are disintegrating as conscript casualties rise and Kremlin pressure mounts. Can Russia adapt, or is it at a tipping point? We'll follow this saga as it unfolds to stay intrigued.